Well, a very good evening to you all. It has been many years since I last darkened your doorway. I recall friends telling me that I must visit a place called Devil's Lake. Well, there are times when I thought I was living in Devil's Lake. But they told me, oh, you must see it, Mrs. Lincoln. You've got to see it with your own eyes to appreciate the beauty. Oh, that was not an exaggeration. And so many folks were so kind and generous to me. Sometimes I think perhaps the public has forgotten about poor old Mary Lincoln. But I am sure all of you are familiar with my dear late husband, President Lincoln. He was the 16th president of the United States. Oh, he was a genius of a man. Why, I don't think I started living until I met my Mr. Lincoln. There are so many wonderful statues and monuments dedicated to his honor. Well, I have been told in a town in the southeastern part of the state of Wisconsin, why, there is a wonderful statue that portrays both Mr. Lincoln and myself. I'm told it's a very good likeness of me. Oh, my Mr. Lincoln. You know, I don't believe I ever had my photograph taken next to Mr. Lincoln. I suppose that was because of the disparity in our heights. As Mr. Lincoln liked to put it, our marriage was the long of it and the short of it. Oh, my dear Mr. Lincoln. Now, many of you might recall that Mr. Lincoln and I spent most of our time in a place called Springfield, Illinois. But the truth of the matter is that we are both fair children of Kentucky. However, as Mr. Lincoln would like to put it, we were born on opposite sides of the blanket. Oh, you see, Mr. Lincoln came from what you might call abject poverty, but he had great aspirations. Aspirations his papa could not understand. I, on the other hand, I was born in Lexington, Kentucky, of the Kentucky Todds. As Mr. Lincoln liked to joke, 1D was good enough for God, but not for the Todds of Kentucky. You see, the Todds were one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in all of Kentucky. My father was Robert Smith Todd. He was a very successful banker, financier, and cotton merchant. Well, I think my papa financed half of Lexington. My dear mother was Eliza Parker Todd. She bore 7 children. I am the 4th of those 7. My mama died when I was very young. I was just 6 years old. Mr. Lincoln and I always shared that. We both lost our sweet mothers at a very early age. Well, within a year of my mama's death, my papa remarried to Miss Elizabeth Humphreys, and they would have 9 more children. Oh, that house in Lexington was getting a mite crowded. Well, I was educated in all the best schools of Lexington. I attended the Ladies' Academy there. I was very proficient in French, Italian, Greek, and Latin. But I also studied mathematics, philosophy, sciences, and of course, the womanly arts. But oh, as I say, that house was getting a mite crowded. And so my stepmother decided to push me out of the nest. She pushed me all the way to Springfield, Illinois, to my older sister Elizabeth's house. You see, Elizabeth, why, she had recently married to Mr. Ninian Edwards. Oh, they have a lovely house there in Springfield. And that would be where I would meet my Mr. Lincoln. Now let me think. It was 1839. You see, I had heard all about this Mr. Lincoln fella, but I had never laid eyes on him. Well, this particular evening, I was at a little party. We called it a soiree, a little gathering at a friend's house. Oh, just young people, some newly married, some engaged, and some still searching the marketplace. Well, that evening, there I was. I was standing in the drawing room chatting with Mr. Stephen Douglas, and I looked out into the hallway, and there stood a long drink of water. Oh, my. His trousers were too short. His coat sleeves were too short. Oh, and his hair stood out at every angle from his head as though he'd just come through a cyclone. And there he stood, polishing his boots on the backs of his trousers. The man looked like a praying mantis. Well, I waited that evening. I waited for this here Mr. Lincoln to make a proper introduction of himself. It was getting quite late in the evening, and the fiddler was about to play the last dance of the evening. And finally, this Mr. Lincoln comes to me, and he said in his very country way, "Miss Todd, I would like to dance with you in the worst way." Well, that evening, Mr. Lincoln and I did dance, and I assure you he danced in the worst way. Oh, ours was a fiery courtship. On again, off again. I suppose because we were both such independent-minded people, such free thinkers. Well, finally, in January 1842, we broke off our engagement. It was by mutual consent. But, oh, our friends would have none of it. Well, one afternoon, I received a note from a friend of mine, Mrs. Francis. Her husband was the editor of the Sangamon newspaper. Well, in my note, she wrote that she'd been ailing for several days and would appreciate if I could come visit her that evening. Well, I was concerned about my friend's health and welfare, so I went on down to visit with her. And lo and behold, who do I meet there? But Mr. Lincoln. Oh, it had been months since we had laid eyes on one another. We just stood there, staring, trying to figure out who should speak first. And then he looked down into my face. He said, "Mary, in the months that I have not seen you, I have been a most miserable man." I looked up into the soft gray eyes of my long, lean Kentuckian, and I replied, "Misery loves company." And so we were married. We married in November 4th of 1842. Oh, it was just a small wedding, just a few friends and a very little family. Mr. Lincoln was late for the wedding, came in looking like a sheep going to slaughter. Oh, why, just that morning, Mr. Lincoln had approached the Reverend Dresser about officiating at our nuptials. He said, "Reverend Dresser, I'd like to get a hitch tonight. Can you accommodate me?" The Reverend did accommodate us, and we were married that rainy Friday evening. Oh, my. I recall how Mr. Lincoln fretted so about what he should have engraved in my ring. He finally settled on something simple, which was his way. Love is eternal. A.L. And for me, that love has indeed been eternal. This simple gold ring is my most precious possession. Well, our married life began in a small rented room above the Globe Tavern there in Springfield. But our family would not stay small for very long. Well, the following August 1st of 1843, we welcomed our first son, Robert Todd Lincoln. Oh, Mr. Lincoln was so excited. Well, he had stayed with me that whole time. And then just after Bobby was born, he came in, and there he was, poking at little Bobby. Said he's a mite squat. More like a Todd than a Lincoln, but I suppose he'll do. The following morning, Mr. Lincoln went off to his law office. You see, my papa did not approve of my choice of husband. And so I was not given a wedding gift. But on the birth of my son and my naming him after my papa relented. He would give us the amount of money necessary to buy a house. We bought a little one-story house on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets there in Springfield. It is the only house we'd ever owned. Not too long after moving into our new home, we welcomed our second son, Edward Baker Lincoln. He was named after a friend of Mr. Lincoln's, Dr. Baker. Oh, my little Eddie. Oh. He was a frail child, prone to illness. But oh, he was such a joy to be with. Well, now, we settled into a proper life there in Springfield. Of course, Mr. Lincoln was doing very well in his law practice, and of course I was looking after my boys in my house. His law practice was doing very well. No thanks to that no-account law partner of house, Billy Herndon. Oh, that dirty dog. Oh, a miserable man. Mr. Lincoln was always out there getting the cases, and old Billy would just sit up there in the law office waiting to collect the fees. Well, you know, that Billy, he's a drunkard and a womanizer. I would never let him anywhere near my boys. Oh, that's enough about Billy. Well, as I say, we'd moved into a comfortable sort of life there in Springfield. And then one day, my little Eddie, why, he began to run a fever. As the days and the weeks passed, my boy was growing sicker and sicker. My dear brother-in-law, Dr. William Wallace, why, he tried so very hard. He tried so very hard to save my boy. Then he finally said to us that my boy's life was in the Lord's hands. It was a cold and very rainy night, dark, sorrowful night when my little Eddie passed away. He was not yet 4 years old. I did not think my heart could hold such sadness, such sorrow. I thought all of the joy had gone out of my life. But the Lord, in His wisdom and His grace, why, He blessed us with another son that very same year. For in December of 1850, we welcomed our third son, William Wallace Lincoln, named after my brother-in-law. Oh, my Willie. Oh, my Willie. He was such a bright and brilliant boy, so much like his father, not in a physical way. But Mr. Lincoln often said that Willie saw things the way he did. Willie thought the way Mr. Lincoln did. And my Willie, he wrote poetry just like his father. Oh, my dear little Willie. Well, very soon we welcomed our fourth and youngest son, Thomas Lincoln. Now, he was named after Mr. Lincoln's father. Mr. Lincoln never got on with his papa, but nonetheless he honored him by naming his youngest son after him. Of course, shortly after Thomas's birth, Mr. Lincoln nicknamed the boy Tad. Said the boy had such a big head and skinny legs, it reminded him of a tadpole. Oh, my Taddy. My Taddy, he could be difficult. Sometimes he would forget things. Even sometimes how to dress himself. But Mr. Lincoln, he loved that boy so. No matter how busy he might be, Mr. Lincoln always found time for Taddy. Well, we had our growing family. Now, at that time, Mr. Lincoln was riding the circuit. Now, when a lawyer rides the circuit, this means that he will travel from town to town trying his different cases. Why, sometimes Mr. Lincoln would be gone days, weeks, or even months. There he'd go, off on horseback no matter what the weather, stuffing his papers up into his hat to ride the circuit. Well, on the occasion of one of these protracted absences, I took it upon myself to have a new second story added to our house. And Mr. Lincoln arrived back in town very late one rainy night, and he could not find his house. He approached a gentleman across the way and inquired of the gentleman, "Sir, I cannot find my house." The gentleman pointed over Mr. Lincoln's shoulder and said, "It's right there, Mr. Lincoln, right where you left it." Well, Mr. Lincoln came on home, and the following morning he was wrestling on the floor with our boys as he so often did. And he stopped, and he looked up at me, and he said, "Mrs. Lincoln, your house is looking mighty fine." Those are the only words he ever spoke to me about that new second story. Well, as I was saying, we'd lived a comfortable life there. You see, Mr. Lincoln, why, he had been elected to the Congress back in 1846, but he promised he'd only serve one term. But he still kept his finger in the pie there in Illinois. And very soon, some gentlemen approached him, and they requested that he run for the United States Senate. Now, his opponent in that race was none other than Mr. Stephen A. Douglas. Now, these two gentlemen, they'd give a whole series of speeches, debates all over the state of Illinois. Now they call it the Lincoln-Douglas debates, although Mr. Douglas would prefer the Douglas-Lincoln debates. But the issue of that day was that of slavery. Could our nation survive with that vile institution? Mr. Lincoln, why, he'd always been opposed to the whole idea of slavery. He once said that if slavery wasn't wrong, then nothing was. But he never declared himself an abolitionist, for that would have been politically unwise. I, on the other hand, declared that I was an abolitionist when I was just 14 years old. You see, quite often we would have distinguished visitors at our house there in Lexington. One such gentleman was Mr. Henry Clay. In fact, on one occasion I remarked to Senator Clay, at that time I was maybe 12 or 13 years old, I remarked that if he was going to be the President of the United States, I'd be more than happy to marry him. But on this occasion, I was maybe 14 years old at this time. And my papa, he would allow me to sit in with the gentlemen after dinner when they had their brandy and cigars and discussed politics. And there I was, sitting at the feet of Mr. Henry Clay and my papa. And I listened. And then I looked up at my father and I said, I am an abolitionist. I cannot in my good conscience own another human being. For you see, I had seen the true inhumanity of slavery. I grew up in a slave-run household. One particular slave, Mammy Sally, she was a large woman, a jolly person. She looked after all the girls in the Todd house. I thought she stayed with us because she loved us. I did not understand that she could not leave my house. I remember when I was a young girl, I was sitting up in the bedroom I shared with my sisters. I looked out the window. It faced the main street of Lexington, and that main street led right to the marketplace. All manner of goods would be paraded along that street to be sold in that marketplace. And I looked out and I saw those black folk tethered together like animals being poked and prodded along the road to be sold in that market. I thought the mother would be sold, the children to be sold elsewhere, perhaps never to see one another again. No, our nation could not survive half slave and half free. The electors did not agree with Mr. Lincoln. They did not elect him to the United States Senate, but that was providential, for he was destined for something much greater. You see, Mr. Lincoln, why, he was a member of the Whig political party, but there was a new party starting up in Wisconsin, a place called Ripon, Wisconsin, called themselves the Republicans. Mr. Lincoln liked some of the planks in their platform. He joined up with this new Republican Party. And in May of 1860, some gentlemen approached Mr. Lincoln, and they requested that he run for the presidency of the United States. I was not surprised. Oh, the day we were leaving for Washington, that was the greatest day, but oh, the night of that election, why, you see, Mr. Lincoln now, he was down at the telegraph office waiting for the results to come on in, and when he found out that it was pretty certain he'd won the election, why, he ran home, all the way home in the rain. He threw open the front doors of our house and he shouted, "Mrs. Lincoln, we have been elected." I merely replied, "Well, sir, I shall put on some coffee. I think we'll be having guests this evening." And again, the day we were leaving for Washington, oh, what a spectacular day that was. Why, folks from all over had gathered there at our house in Springfield, and the boys threw open the windows and they were tossing ribbons and confetti to the crowds below. And down at the train depot, why, the crowds, oh, they begged Mr. Lincoln to make a speech. He said only a few words, but he promised he would come back. He promised he'd return to Springfield, to the place and to the people he loved the best. Oh, I was so excited to be in Washington City. I could hardly wait to see the Executive Mansion, the House of the People. And when I saw it, the place was filthy. Why, there were rats running down the corridors, and I don't mean just Democrats. Why, the wallpaper was peeling off the walls, the carpets were threadbare, there was stuffing coming out of the furniture. I approached Mr. Lincoln with the problem, and he looked round and back at me, and he said, "I don't think the Lincolns have ever lived in a finer house, don't you?" I did not. Well, finally, the Congress would allocate funds for the restoration and redecoration of the Executive Mansion, hardly enough, $25,000. I worked so hard. I went all the way to New York. I bought the finest imported carpets, imported lace curtains. I even bought chandeliers from France. Oh, the house did look beautiful. Even Mr. Lincoln agreed it looked beautiful. And the newspapers, oh, those newspapers, they'd never been very kind to Mr. Lincoln or myself. But one reporter wrote, "Mrs. Lincoln, the First Lady, has redecorated the Executive Mansion in an elegant and splendid manner." However, there was a problem. You see, I've never been very good with money. And it seems that in redecorating the house, well, I had overspent, and I did not want Mr. Lincoln to find out. There were two gentlemen there on the staff of the mansion, and they showed me how I could move around some of the figures to hide the discrepancy. And then there was a scandal and a congressional investigation. Oh, Mr. Lincoln was furious. He said we'd have to pay back the extra funds out of our own money, which we did, $13,000. But oh, that house did look beautiful. Well, we decided then we would have sort of an open house, a party to show off all the new decorations and furniture. Oh, it was to be a lovely event. While we had tables set up in all the rooms with all manner of sweets. We had a chef carving a huge roast of beef. We had a champagne fountain. And oh, I had a new dress made for the occasion by Mrs. Elizabeth Keckley of Washington. Oh, my dear Lizzie. Lizzie is a lovely lady of color. She is not only my seamstress and my hairdresser, but most of all, she has been my dearest friend. And oh, that dress was so lovely. It was made of a pale lavender taffeta, very low on the shoulders. Oh, I was much younger then. It had a very long train, and that evening I wore flowers all the way from the shoulder down to the skirt, and flowers in my hair, and just a simple pearl necklace. Oh, I was so proud of that dress. That evening, Mr. Lincoln came up to my room after I finished dressing. He folded himself into a tiny chair, and then he surveyed me from top to toe, and then he spoke. Seems like the cat has a mighty long tail tonight. Too bad some of that tail couldn't be up around her neck. Well, I was devastated. Usually Mr. Lincoln was so kind with his remarks and compliments. But that evening, as we went down to greet our guests, Mr. Lincoln bent down very low. He slipped his hand into mine and he whispered, "Your dress is lovely, Mrs. Lincoln. It compliments your eyes." It was so kind. That evening would prove to be very difficult for us. Early in the day, the boys, Taddy and Willie, had begun to run fevers. Mr. Lincoln and I spent the whole evening running back and forth up the stairs to look after our boys. As the days passed, Taddy recovered. But oh, my Willie, he was growing sicker each passing day. And all those doctors did him little good. It was on a Thursday, a rainy Thursday, February, about 5 o'clock in the evening. My Willie, my brilliant and bright boy, passed away. He was only 11 years old. I could not withstand this loss. I shut myself off from everyone. I saw no one. I did not even attend my boy's funeral. I shut myself off from Mr. Lincoln. I saw no one. One evening, I saw a light in my boy's room. I went down the hallway, and there, on the floor in the doorway, was Mr. Lincoln, his knees tucked up under his chin, and he shook as he wept. He cried out over and over, "Oh, my Willie, my dear boy, you were too good for this earth. Oh, my Willie." I'm ashamed to say that I did not comfort him in his grief. I had my own. Days, months passed, and I did not recover from my loss. Finally, one day, Mr. Lincoln took me sternly by the arm. He pulled me over to a window. He pointed out past a line of trees to a small white building. He screamed at me, "Mrs. Lincoln, do you know what that building is? That is an asylum. If you do not get hold of yourself, I shall send you there." I did not want to go there. I did not know what to do. I did not know where to turn. I finally turned to my dear friend, Lizzie. Lizzie had lost a son. She could understand, and she helped me. I began to go to the hospitals where the boys were taken, the boys who'd been wounded in battle. I took food to them whenever I could. I sat with them. I read to them. I wrote letters for them, to their wives, mothers, sweethearts. I held them as they lay dying. But these newspapers, they would continue to print these obscene drawings of my husband portrayed as a baboon, a wild animal who could not govern this country. And I was portrayed as a thief and a traitor. My little sister Emily had been driven from the president's house. They too accused her of being a thief and a traitor, selling goods out the back door to support the Confederacy. My little sister Emily, a widow at 27 years with 2 small children, she has lost her husband, Benjamin Hill. I lost 2 of my brothers in that filthy war. My brother Alexander was only 18 years old when he died in New Orleans. All of these men were Confederate officers. They fought and they died for what they believed in, but that is not what I believe in. I have always been a loyal patriot of this union. And I have always been loyal to my Mr. Lincoln. Oh, please excuse me. Oh, I know if Mr. Lincoln were here, he would chastise me and reprimand me for my behavior. Oh, I do apologize. Well, finally, that filthy, bloody war was coming to an end. It was springtime in Washington. Trees were budding out, flowers starting to bloom. It was Friday morning, Good Friday morning. Mr. Lincoln came to me. He asked if I would go on a carriage ride with him that afternoon, just the 2 of us. Oh, I was so excited. There had been such little time for these things in the past years. That afternoon, we rode out into the Washington countryside. We were not the President and First Lady that day. We were just the Lincolns of Springfield, Illinois. Mr. Lincoln, he spoke about what he wanted to do after his term was complete. He said he wanted to travel, wanted to go to Europe to see all the beautiful art and artwork that he'd only read about. And we would take our youngest son, Taddy, and the 3 of us would travel. Our older son, Robert, he was pretty much grown on his own. The 3 of us would travel. Mr. Lincoln remarked that he wanted to go to Jerusalem to walk in the footprints of our Lord. I remember that day I was wearing a navy blue silk dress with white lace collar and cuffs, and at the neckline I had a small bunch of violets. Mr. Lincoln said it made me look youthful. We left the carriage and we walked a short distance together. we came across a little pond surrounded by trees. Mr. Lincoln commented how serene and beautiful and peaceful. And then a cloud, a shadow seemed to come over his face. He took my hands in his. He said to me, "Molly, I am 9 years older than you. I think I shall be passing on first. And when that time comes, I want you to promise me you will lay me to rest in such a place as this, so sweet and green." His words chilled me. His had such terrible dreams in the past weeks. But I promised that I would hold true to that. But I thought it would be a very long time before I had to make that decision. Well, that evening, we were to attend the theater, the Ford's Theater, to see a play called Our American Cousin. It was a farce, a comedy, and oh, Mr. Lincoln loved those comedies so. It was starring a popular young actress, Miss Laura Keene. I thought it would calm and help the president to soothe his troubled mind. I had invited General and Mrs. Grant to attend the theater with us, but that old Mrs. Grant said she had some sort of important business in Philadelphia, New Jersey, or some such place, which was just fine with me. Then I did not have to look at that ugly old face all evening. I had also invited my son Robert to attend the theater that evening, but the dear boy said he had other plans with some young officer friends of his to see the sights in Washington. Robert thought his mother was so naive that she did not know what kind of sights these young men would be looking at. I finally invited a young couple, newly engaged, Miss Clara Harris and her fiancé, Major Rathbone. I thought it would be so joyful to be with this young couple at such a wonderful time in their lives. Oh, when we entered the theater, the whole audience stood and cheered Mr. Lincoln. Men and women threw their hats into the air. He just extended his hands, indicating everybody should be seated. I sat very close to my husband that evening. I slipped my hand into his and I leaned in very close and I said, "Whatever will Miss Harris think of me?" He just patted my hand and said, "Never you mind what she thinks." And then suddenly there was a popping noise and a puff of smoke, and then this dark-haired man began rushing around the box screaming, and the audience was screaming. Oh. And then I saw there was blood on Mr. Lincoln's collar and on the chair. My husband had been shot. They carried him out into the street. There was a light rainfall and it struck his cheek, but he did not respond. They carried him across the way to a boarding house. A kind gentleman there had given up his room that the president's wounds might be tended to. They laid him on this bed that was too small for his frame. They laid him crossways, and they patted up his head with pillows and towels. And my Mr. Lincoln, he just kept bleeding. All night long, those doctors rushed in and out. But my Mr. Lincoln just kept bleeding. Finally, towards morning, his color changed. He became very gray. His breathing became very labored. At 22 minutes after 7 on the morning of April 15th, 1865, my Mr. Lincoln died. My husband had been murdered. I had given up my husband to be murdered. The great emancipator had been murdered. Oh, in that big old White House, it was wrapped in black crepe, every pillar and post. And then that long trip through all those cities, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and on and on. Our boy Willie had been placed aboard the train with Mr. Lincoln that he might have that final journey with his father. And every step of the way along those tracks, people gathered. Men, women, children, black and white, and they all wept. They wept for the great emancipator. Finally in Springfield, Illinois, my little Eddie, my sweet Willie, and my Mr. Lincoln were all laid to rest beneath a hillside in a borrowed tomb at the Oakwood Cemetery. I did not return to Springfield at that time. Taddy and I went on to Chicago and then on to New York. It seemed as though I could not rest. I wandered endlessly. We lived in Germany for some time. But then my Taddy, he was growing very thin. Day by day, I did not trust him to the doctors there in Germany. We went to France, and then I decided that we would return to America where we really belonged. We came back to Chicago. It was a warm summer's day, July of 1873, when my Taddy, my troublesome sunshine, passed away. He was only 18 years old. I only have my oldest son, Robert, left, and needless to say, we have not gotten on very well. There was that whole issue of him packing me off to a sanitarium. But I must say, he has given me a wonderful gift. I have a granddaughter, and she is named after me, Mary Ann Todd Lincoln. Oh, a divinely beautiful child. Oh, my. I have kept all of you so long this evening. I do apologize. But I'm packing all of my things together, and I'm going to be going to my sister Elizabeth's house down in Springfield. She's been kind enough to have me come stay with her. my health seems to deteriorate as each day passes. I left for a short time. Back in 1878, I went back to France, and I stayed there for some time in a little seaside city, just a town really, called Pas. And in the morning, the artists would line up their paintings along the boardwalk. One morning I purchased one of those paintings and I took it back to the house that I had rented. And I was going to hang it over the fireplace mantel, and I fell off the chair and injured my back. You see, I've had a painful back ever since an injury way back in 1863. I was hospitalized there in France, and that's when I contacted my dear grandnephew, Louis Baker. He is the grandson of my sister Elizabeth. He brought me back to New York and looked after me. And now I will return to my sister's house. Now, I must insist, if y'all come down to Springfield, now you must stop by and visit my sister Elizabeth. Oh, she would love to have you all in for tea. Now, that's the bigger house. It's the Edwards house, rather. It is on the corner of 2nd Street and Main. And oh, it's a lovely house. It's the most elegant house in all of Springfield. And I insist y'all stop in and pay a visit to us. You know, I look back on a life and I see that my life has seen the depths of sadness and sorrow. But I have also seen and felt the height of joy. For I have stood at the side of the great emancipator. Thank you. Thank you kindly. Thank you very kindly. Oh, do please be seated. Are there any questions that I might answer? For if I do not know the answer, I'll be more than happy to lie. Does anyone have a question that I might answer for you? You usually ask when I die, and I'm feeling much better, thank you. Yes, madam.
Where is the statue of you and Mr. Lincoln in the statue?
The lady asked where is the statue of Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln, and that is in the city of Racine, Wisconsin. It is in a park on the main street there, in a park, and Mr. Lincoln is seated and Mrs. Lincoln is standing next to him with her hand on his shoulder, and she's divinely attired, as I always would be, with a ball gown and flowers in her hair. And it was a gift to the city by one of the citizens of Racine. A lady decided that Mrs. Lincoln needed a statue, and so she decided to have that erected in the park there on Main Street many years ago. Are there any other questions that I might answer? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Did you attend with Mr. Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address?
No, I did not. I did not attend, and there was a very good reason. I was very ill after an accident, a back injury that occurred on July 1st of 1863. And so when November came along and he was delivering what I believe to be the best he had ever written and spoken, I was still unable to travel, and it was not appropriate that I would attend such a service. At that time, it was not appropriate for a First Lady to always be hovering with her husband. A First Lady always stands beside and behind the President on his right side, 2 steps behind. That is the proper place for the First Lady to be. I've heard from some folks that some First Ladies don't abide with that. They stand in front, on the side, or behind, or wherever they darn well please. But that is proper. Are there any other questions? Yes.
What happened to your son,
Robert, well, depending on how far you want me to go. If I leave Mary Lincoln, I'll leave her lovely Lexington accent. The lady asked whatever happened to Robert. Robert would go on to be very, very successful. He would become an attorney. He was a Yale graduate. He was a very highly educated man and didn't mind trading on the Lincoln name. After all, when you look up you're online looking up a lawyer and you see Smith and then you see Lincoln. Hey, I'm going with Lincoln. So he did trade on the Lincoln name. He would become a very successful attorney. He would go on to marry the daughter of the richest man in Iowa, Miss Mary Harlan, and they would have 3 children. The oldest child was Mary Ann Todd Lincoln. The second child was Abraham Lincoln. He was known as Jack. And the third child was another girl, Jessie Lincoln. Unfortunately, Jack Lincoln died when he was about 19 years old. He died what we call today a flesh-eating bacteria. Very painful, very, very prolonged death. He died as a young man. He died in France. And he was brought back to the United States and buried. But so that's the Lincoln name dies. Mary Ann Todd Lincoln would marry 3 times during her life, and she would have 1 child, and he would die at the age of about 11. He choked to death. And the youngest, Jessie Lincoln, she would have 2 children. And Peggy and Lincoln. And they did not have any children. Neither of them married nor had any children. So the Lincoln line is completely gone from the direct descendants. I've had people tell me, and I'm sorry, but there aren't any. There are no direct descendants from the Lincolns. But Robert would become very successful. As I say, he was an attorney. He would become the CEO and chairman of the Pullman Motor Coach Company. He also would become the ambassador to England. He was approached on several occasions to run for the Senate and the presidency and the vice presidency, and he turned it down. He had an aversion to becoming an elected official. In fact, if he were in the same town when a president was there, if the president was coming to New York and Robert was there, Robert got on a train and left. He was with a gentleman by the name of McKinley. He was standing next to McKinley, and in fact, as McKinley was going to the ground, it was Robert Lincoln who lowered McKinley there after McKinley was shot. He was hanging on to Robert's coat sleeve. And after that incident, Robert never stayed in the same city. At one point, he was staying in a hotel, and he heard early in the morning that the president was going to be coming to that hotel, and he quickly packed and he got out of town. He always felt he was rather a jinx to the President of the United States. He felt a bit of guilt not having attended the theater that night with his father. Perhaps he may have saved him. It's always we have that regret, that nagging regret that perhaps he could have done something. Any other questions that I might answer for you? Yes?
What was Mary's relationship with her Kentucky Confederate?
Oh, Yes, the lady asked what was her relationship with the Kentucky, with the Lexington and the Kentucky Todds, who, for the most part, were Confederates. Very difficult. In fact, I was remarking earlier that, you see, you had the Cincinnati Todds and you had the Lexington Todds. The Cincinnati Todds went with the Union, the Lexington Todds went with the Confederates. And even today, if you get them in the same room, the Lexingtons will sit there and the Kentucky and the Cincinnatis will sit there and they'll stare at each other and go, huh. It's really strange. They have a division because there are a number of people who are descendants of of Robert Todd. He did have 16 children, and many of those children had children carrying the Todd name. And so there are still many around in both Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. There are still a lot of Todds. They're with us forever. Any other questions that I might? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned Lizzie Keckley,
Yes,
your
dressmaker.
seamstress. Yes. Did she stay with you after you left the White House as a confidant, or?
The question was about Lizzie Keckley, Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, whether Lizzie stayed with Mrs. Lincoln. It's a very sad story. They were very, very close. They really were. She was very faithful to Mrs. Lincoln, and Mrs. Lincoln would walk on hot coals for Lizzie. She helped her considerably. But a rather unscrupulous reporter from New York located Lizzie Keckley and offered her money to write a tell-all. And she saw the money, and she was not a highly schooled, educated woman. She saw the money and she thought, boy, my son, she had a son yet who was struggling, and she thought, which any of us would say, well, gee, I can help my son out. However, the things that she told the reporter didn't exactly get into the book the way she told them. And it turned out that it was very nasty and very, very cruel. And it really hurt Mrs. Lincoln to the quick. And that really broke the relationship for many years. Mrs. Lincoln, would occasionally write to Lizzie, and Lizzie would correspond with her, but it was never the same. There was a tremendous amount of mistrust. And afterward, Lizzie would tell her again and again and again what happened, but Mrs. Lincoln said, nonetheless, it got out in print, and things were said that you and I both know were not true. And it was an absurd piece when you read it. It's totally ridiculous because, first of all, we have to look at, you have the President of the United States and the First Lady, and remember, it's the 1860s. Life is much different. In this book, this writer claims to be witness to these terrible arguments. Number one, Lizzie is not going to be in the room when Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln are having any conversation. That's the first part. No matter what, she's not going to be in the room. So right there is ridiculous that she was a witness to these conversations. And it was about how could she get more money to the Confederacy from the Union Treasury, because the Confederacy was having troubles. Can't we just send them money? Send them a couple of buckets of money and everything will be better. And none of that ever happened. And one more? Anybody else? Okay. Thank you so very much for coming to meet Mrs. Lincoln.